Welcome to Language and Learning by Jeff Buck. Why I'm not voting for the U.S. presidential candidates for the 2024 election. With the U.S. presidential election coming up very soon, I want to talk about some election vocabulary and tell you who I'm voting for and not voting for and why. There are two main political parties in the United States. The Republican Party, which is conservative and therefore is on the right, and the Democratic Party, which is liberal and therefore on the left. Some people cynically call the election process a selection, as they believe that the winner is chosen by those who have the real power in the US, bankers, corporations, etc. And I tend to agree. Either way, if you bother to vote, which is the legal right of all US citizens 18 years old and over, you have to go to a voting location, take a ballot, enter a voting booth or box, and choose your preferred presidential candidate and others running for other offices. You can also vote online, but voting is not legally required. You can abstain if you want to, meaning not vote. Each U.S. presidential candidate must be a native citizen of the United States, must be at least 35 years old, and must have resided in the U.S. for at least 14 years. Obviously, these rules apply to the VP candidates as well. Candidates normally announce their candidacy 1.5 years before the election and start their campaign 1 year prior. The parties have a national convention in the summer before the November election to declare their final candidate for the presidency. This year, the DNC, Democratic National Convention, was held in August, and the RNC, Republican National Convention, was held in July. Election Day is always on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, meaning from November 2nd to 8th. Blue states tend to be Democratic, and red states tend to be Republican. Swing states are states that could vote either way, so they are also known as toss-up states and battleground states. This means that the presidential candidates have to focus a lot of their time on those places in order to win. Technically, in the United States, presidents are not elected by popular vote. They are officially elected by the Electoral College system, a secret group of people who usually agree with the voters, but they're not required to. Each state is worth the number of congressmen and senators that it has. This number is the Electoral College value the state is worth. Therefore, presidential candidates spend more time campaigning in states that are worth more Electoral College votes. The candidate who gets 270 votes or more of the possible 538 votes, 100 senators, 435 congressmen, and 3 electors from Washington, D.C., wins and becomes the next U.S. president. Inauguration Day, when the new or incumbent person already in office, the president, takes the oath of office, is always on January 20th, unless the 20th is a Sunday, in which case the inauguration takes place on the 21st. Kamala Harris. She's obviously a Democrat and the current vice president or VP. Democrats tend to be liberal, really on the left of the political spectrum. She, like a lot of modern Democrats, supports a lot of socialist and communist policies, including open borders. Oddly enough, Harris supports the use of prisoners for slave labor, which is completely legal according to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. She defied a U.S. Supreme Court order requiring her to release prisoners in California because she wanted to keep them there to be used as cheap labor. Also, she declared war on truancy, children not attending school, in California because it was costing the state a lot of federal funding. In order to make an example, Harris put an innocent black woman, Sheree Peoples, in jail because her 11-year-old disabled daughter physically could not attend school. This ruined her life. As a result of Harris's actions, Ms. Peoples lost her job and house and almost lost her children. Ms. Peoples said this about Harris: "She's a fake. She has no empathy, and her policies are bad for parents. My message to Black Americans: do not trust Kamala Harris." Harris's mantra is the nonsensical sentence, What can be, unburdened by what has been? What the fuck does that even mean? And that's why I'm not voting for Kamala Harris. Donald Trump. Trump is a Republican now, but he used to be a Democrat, believe it or not. The Republican Party, also known as the GOP, Grand Old Party, is the conservative party in the United States. Trump, having already served as POTUS, President of the United States, uses the campaign slogan MAGA, Make America Great Again, which he did not create. It's been used by other presidents, including Republican and also former Democrat Ronald Reagan and Democrat Bill Clinton. Most people who hate Trump focus on his personality and what he says, specifically how he says things. They say he isn't presidential in his behavior. I couldn't care less. Many people who support Trump want him to become president again so he can fulfill his promise of securing the border and dealing with all the millions of illegal aliens, really invaders, which I agree with Trump on, though I don't think that's the most important solution to the problem. What needs to happen is that the United States needs to stop interfering in foreign affairs and economies and stop engaging in overseas wars, all of which cause people who would otherwise prefer to stay in their home country to have to flee and seek safety and life elsewhere. Plus, nowadays, there are more incentives than ever for people to live in the U.S. illegally: cash cards, free housing, driver's licenses, etc. So more and more foreigners want to move to the United States illegally as a result. Simply put, bring our troops home and stop incentivizing people to come to and live in the United States of America illegally. And with regard to what to do about the illegals already present in the U.S., the most efficient and cost-effective means of dealing with them would be to arrest and imprison their employers, which would force the illegals to return home at their own expense. But what are some parts of the Trump campaign platform that aren't getting that much attention, but really need to be talked about? Well, there's eminent domain, which is the power of the state, meaning government, to take private property for public use, roads, government buildings, utilities, etc., for just compensation, supposedly, meaning a fair price. The term eminent domain comes from the Latin phrase dominium eminens, which means supreme ownership. How's that for government service? My grandfather lost his house in Natick, Massachusetts in the 1950s when the state was building the Massachusetts Turnpike, Mass Pike, which is part of Route 90, which goes all the way across the U.S. from east to west. The government didn't offer him enough money, so he complained. The government then offered less money and made an example of him by humiliating him in the local newspaper. So he moved his family, my mother's, to Framingham, the next town over, where I was born and raised. But the town of Natick didn't stop there. They left my grandfather a small, useless leftover tract of land next to the Mass Pike as a big fuck you to him. My grandpa Wally, who I'm named after, Jeffrey Wallace Tripp Buck, refused to ever drive on the Pike, even though not doing so was a major inconvenience for his family. And the Pike was supposed to be a toll road. You have to pay to use a toll road. Temporarily. But to this day, about 70 years later, you still have to pay to use it. And my family had to pay taxes on that useless tract of land indefinitely. It still technically owns it. When his widow, my grandmother, was quite old, she tried to get the government to take the remaining land by simply not paying the yearly tax of 25 cents, 66 cents, $1, or whatever. Instead, the town threatened to humiliate her again by putting her name in the paper as a tax cheat. So that's my personal experience with eminent domain. It is, in fact, about supreme government ownership of everything in the town or city, state, and country that you live in. And it's something that Donald Trump has always used to promote his business development. It's the first thing that I learned about him 15 to 20 years ago when I first heard about him. He takes advantage of little people, common people with no power, money, or influence to build golf courses and parking lots so he can make big bucks. He tried doing so to a widow because he wanted her house so he could build a limousine parking lot for a casino. Fortunately, he lost, and the widow kept her house. But that's who he unapologetically is. And his border wall, which I support in theory, would require the use of eminent domain, since most of the border land is privately owned. Now let's talk about police immunity. Right now, police all across America have what is known as qualified immunity, meaning they're generally protected from prosecution, punishment, and being sued by citizens if they abuse or harm people. At most, they're suspended or fired, and then rehired by the same or another department, and the taxpayers pay for the financial settlement, if there is one. Trump not only doesn't want to end this, but he also wants to extend this to full immunity from prosecution for police officers, which would be disastrous for freedom in America. And that brings us to the U.S. military. There's an 1878 law in the U.S. known as Posse Comitatus, which prohibits the federal government from using the federal military on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens. The way that the government gets around that law is by using the National Guard, state soldiers, and by militarizing the police. But Trump wants to go further by using federal soldiers against American citizens on U.S. soil. And that's why I'm not voting for Donald Trump. However, given the border crisis, illegal alien invasion, and the resulting massive support that he has from Republicans and from Democrats of all races and ethnicities, I think Trump is a shoo-in, which means I have no doubt that he'll win. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I'm a Massachusetts native, but even though it's an extremely liberal state, I grew up in an extremely conservative family, and I'm still quite conservative. The Kennedy family hails from Massachusetts as well, and is a political dynasty there. And with John F. Kennedy as the past president, is somewhat so on a national scale also. And they've always been Democrats. However, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of Robert F. Kennedy, U.S. Attorney General under his brother John F. Kennedy, a nephew of JFK, both of whom were assassinated in the 1960s, switched from being a Democrat to being an independent in 2023. Basically, he never changed his political values. Rather, the Democratic Party changed theirs. RFK has spent much of his career as an environmental lawyer, winning cases against large corporations, and he has a peculiar voice problem known as spasmodic dysphonia, which is a neurological speech disorder that causes the sufferer's voice to have involuntary spasms and be shaky and hoarse. The term spasmodic comes from the Greek spasmos, or span, meaning to pull, and the prefix dis is Latin for not or no, and the root phonia comes from the Greek meaning sound, so dysphonia means difficulty in speaking, usually evidenced by hoarseness. I had never been a Kennedy family supporter, but earlier this year, due to my dislike of Trump and Harris, especially the latter, I looked into RFK and decided that I liked most of his positions and that I would vote for him, if I bothered to vote at all. However, recently, realizing that he did not have a good chance of winning the presidency, and fearing that people voting for him instead of Trump would result in Harris winning the election, RFK Jr. decided to withdraw from the election and support Trump. And that's why I'm not voting for Kennedy. Is there anyone else? There are a number of third-party candidates, but they have no chance of winning, so I'm not going to bother voting for them either. But who really controls the country anyway? The puppet president? Corporations? Bankers? Edward Bernay, the father of propaganda, author of the 1928 book Propaganda, and nephew of Sigmund Freud, said the following: "We are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." And there are invisible rulers who control the destinies of millions. It is not generally realized to what extent the words and actions of our most influential public men are dictated by shrewd persons operating behind the scenes. And in almost every act of our lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. And if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. And George Carlin, an American comedian / philosopher, said the following: "Anyone can become president. That's the problem. The owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. And governments don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. That's against their interests. They want obedient workers, people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it. And I have certain rules I live by. My first rule: I don't believe anything the government tells me. And the politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. And if you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you're going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. And finally, the Healan Dialectic states that there's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. In other words, there's a problem, a reaction, and a solution. So you have people who viscerally hate Trump, or who used to. But now, with the economy being so bad, the border and illegal alien invasion being out of control, coincidence? And with crazy Kamala Harris being the only other option, a lot of people are running to, if not embracing and celebrating Trump. And that's why I'm not voting for anyone. How about you? Would you choose the lesser of two evils? If you're a U.S. citizen and are going to vote, who are you going to vote for and why? If you're not a U.S. citizen, who do you hope wins? Tell us who you support and why in the comment section. Or if you think voting is pointless and a waste of time, tell us why in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and enjoy the election.